morning. As Hinka mentioned, my name is Breslauer. I work for the Institute for Economics and Peace. We are a not-for-profit think tank headquartered in Sydney, Australia, with offices in New York, Mexico, and in Brussels as well. And I'm joined here today by my colleagues Aubrey Fox, Laura, and Namrata, who are around. So I'm here to share the findings from this year's Global Peace Index, which is the primary piece of research coming out of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And this is our 10th year. So we're really excited to be able to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this report, but also because now we have this tremendous data set to be able to work with that allows us to have greater insights into peacefulness. Why are we doing an index like this? Well, it's important to be able to try to measure your goals. And we believe that peace is a positive, achievable, and tangible goal. So as I mentioned, the Global Peace Index is in its 10th year. It's a ranking of 163 countries and territories according to their relative states of peace. So what we're looking at is a scale from least peaceful to most peaceful. We're not saying one country is completely at peace or another country is completely unpeaceful. The way that we put this index together is in a three-part system to help peer review and ensure independence. So we work with the Economist Intelligence Unit, which collects the data and scores a number of qualitative indicators. We have a panel of experts that reviews the methodology and the scores each year. And the Institute for Economics and Peace does the analysis and puts together some of the indicators. Now we really see the Global Peace Index having three primary roles. The first is a role for education. The second is a tool to help inform policy. And the third is really as a communications tool. Now, taking a look at the indicators, the index is a holistic measurement of peace. So that means that we're trying to take a very complicated, multi-dimensional concept and make it more simple to understand. So we cover three major domains that reflect both internal and external levels of peacefulness of the country, and try to get beyond this idea that peace is the absence of war. No, peace is the absence of violence or fear of violence. It's also the presence of institutions and relations and factors that help support peaceful societies. So the index includes 6 measures of domestic and international conflict, 10 measures of societal safety and security, and 7 measures of militarization. And when we take those 23 indicators, and they are weighted and they are banded. These are methodological considerations to try to clean up the data and make it more comparable. This is the map of peacefulness that we see for the 2016 Global Peace Index. And once again, what is this map showing? Well, it's showing relative states of peace. So countries that are orange or red are less peaceful than countries that are in the shades of green. So this is really about looking more at relative states of peacefulness than it is about ordinal rankings. This year, for the first time, we were able to include Palestine in the index. So as I mentioned, we do include territories. We include territories with populations over 1 million people where there are enough data for us to be able to bring together a comparable ranking. So we're at 163 countries, and that's covering 99.7% of the population. Now, what have we found this year? So over the past year, we found that overall, global levels of peace continue to deteriorate. Now, the gap between the most peaceful and least peaceful countries continues to widen. So what we're seeing is an increasing inequality in peacefulness around the world. Now, over the past year, the average level of country peacefulness declined by 0.53%, which might not seem like a lot, but is actually a significant amount, and it's the largest decline we've seen in the last 6 years. Now, while the world became less peaceful in 2015, many countries did improve. So slightly more countries improved, 81, than deteriorated, 79. But the size of the deteriorations were larger, which has brought down the global score. And so this really shows the complex nature of peace. And it underscores that while there's an emergence of concerning negative trends, they're not uniform globally, and positives can be drawn from the data. The indicators that we see really bringing down the global score are the impact of terrorism and political instability. That means that there's a larger impact and higher levels of political instability. And this was countered by improvements in the indicators of UN peacekeeping funding and the number of security officers and police rate. And just to note that our indicator of UN peacekeeping funding measures the percentage to which a country has paid its dues towards its committed UN peacekeeping dues. And this year what we saw was that more countries are meeting their commitments on time than ever before. Security officers and police rate is a bit of a mixed trend because for the Global Peace Index, the more police you have, the less peaceful you are. However, we understand that in many countries that are facing high violent crime, investments in rule of law are important. So in some countries there's a misallocation or overallocation of resources where security officers and police might be too many, but in others it's needed. So let's take a look quickly at the top line highlights. Syria remains the most peaceful nation in this year's Global Peace Index. That's,
the least
peaceful nation in this year's Global Peace Index. I was going to say unsurprisingly, but perhaps my previous comment might have made it surprising. So we see 60% of the population is displaced and an estimated 470,000. These are tremendously high figures. Iceland, again, is the most peaceful country. And in terms of looking at improvements, Panama and Thailand have risen. And Central America and the Caribbean region has had the largest regional improvement. Now, I do want to note here that when we're looking at these improvements, and particularly, for instance, the regional improvement, Central America and the Caribbean is coming off of a bit of a lower base. So it's not to say that that region has become peaceful, it's that it's become more peaceful. It's still facing high levels of homicide, high levels of violent crime, and threats of organized crime. The majority of the deterioration in global peace is due to developments in the Middle East and North Africa, which has been the least peaceful region in the world and is still the least peaceful region in the world. And notably, when we started the Global Peace Index in 2007, the Middle East and North Africa was in the middle of the regional ranking, and Sub-Saharan Africa was at the bottom. Sub-Saharan Africa has itself risen, but the Middle East and North Africa has fallen so dramatically since 2010 that it's squarely at the bottom. Now, Europe has deteriorated slightly as a region, but it still remains the most peaceful. And when we take a look at the 10 most peaceful countries, one important point to note is that countries that are in the top 10 usually tend to stay there. They have a level of stability and resilience that tends to keep them towards the top. So that shocks aren't incredibly destabilizing in these countries. Portugal itself rose significantly in the index this year. It improved across a number of dimensions, including likelihood of violent demonstrations, but also political terror scale and political instability. Ireland and Finland came out of the top 10 as a result of Portugal's rise. Now, when we look at the least peaceful countries, despite the order you see here, Syria is the least peaceful country, followed by South Sudan. Now, last year, Yemen was not in the bottom 10, but now there are a number of international actors in Yemen with an estimated 8,100 people killed. And we're seeing this deterioration in peacefulness in Yemen, in Ukraine, in Libya, all in internationalized internal conflict. And that's an important point, is that a lot of these conflicts now are becoming more internationalized. Now, countries in the bottom of the index also stay there. They're caught in a cycle of violence that's difficult to break. But perhaps more importantly for this year is to look at the 10-year trends that we've found. Now, what have we seen? Over 10 years, we're continuing to see a notable decline in peacefulness. It's reached 2.44% since 2008. And this has really been driven over the past decade by a continuation of longer-term trends in peacefulness, away from external conflicts between states and towards more internal conflicts within states. And now, what are the factors that are impacting the global trend? We see the intensity of internal conflicts rising, violent demonstrations going up. And interestingly, we've seen the number of violent demonstrations go up after the global financial crisis, not just in lower income or conflict-affected countries, but also in European countries that are high in the global peace index. Perceptions of criminality are rising, internal conflict deaths are rising, and the number of refugees and IDPs has risen dramatically, as well as the impact of terrorism. So I'm just going to run through a couple of these major trends. Firstly, terrorism. Until 2014, the impact of terrorism was increasing and reaching an all-time high. So you'll see here on this graph that after 9/11, levels of terrorism were lower, and they've been rising since, and we see here impact of terrorism mapped against certain world events, and a particularly dramatic rise after the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And what we're seeing now really is more of an internationalization of these attacks. So up until recently, what we had found was that terrorist attacks in OECD countries were primarily driven by lone wolf actors and lone wolf attacks. But in the past year or so, we've seen more transnational terrorist attacks, and that is a different problem, and it's also a concerning trend. What's perhaps a more stunning trend is that the number of battle deaths are at a 25-year high. They're close to 20% higher than in 1989. And these are conservative estimates that we use from PRIO. The International Institute of Strategic Studies provides their own estimates that are actually higher. So we can see battle deaths from conflict are actually between 112 and 167,000, depending on which estimates we use. And now most of these are coming from civil wars that are becoming more deadly. Half of the battle deaths are from Syria and 15,000 each from Iraq and Afghanistan. If there were not conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, then deaths would only be about 28,000. And as a result, we're seeing that these levels of conflict and violence are causing massive displacement. So we see this figure. There are 60 million people displaced. It's the highest since World War II. 60 million is about the population of the UK or of France. So it's a huge number. And the conflict in Syria was responsible for the vast majority of this increase. In 2007, just 0.1% of the Syrian population was classified as refugees or IDPs. Now this figure rose to over 3% in 2015, most of which were IDPs, although there's been an increase in them leaving the country and the European migration crisis that we're now fighting. However, there are 9 other countries with more than 10% of their population displaced, including Colombia, including Somalia, including South Sudan. But what we're also seeing as a result is that there's an international response and an international commitment towards peacekeeping that's growing. So the number of peacekeepers has steadily increased over the last 15 years, with a 150% increase since the start of the Afghanistan war. So we're seeing a larger number of troops. But what's also important to remember here is of the conflicts on the Security Council agenda are conflicts that have restarted. So what this implies is that for the peacekeeping forces on the ground, they have to be able to be trained to understand the changing threats that they're facing. We have to, as a community, better address and understand how to invest in peace building efforts and how to try to move away from each crisis and invest earlier in prevention. Now, one way that IEP is looking at some of these issues is to try to better understand the costs and investments, the costs of violence and the investments in peace building efforts. So each year, we basically do accounting and a tally of the economic impact related to containing, preventing, and dealing with the consequences of violence. So we look at 16 different dimensions, and the figure is enormous. It's $13.6 trillion, the economic impact of violence in 2015. Now that's 13.3% of the world's GDP. It's almost $1,900 a person. And it's 11 times the size of foreign direct investment. And this is still a conservative study. Now, the largest category of expenditure is around military and internal security. But here you can see the different dimensions that we're able to look at. And you can see the very small boxes around peace building and UN peacekeeping. So this year, we tried to do a more in-depth study, and working with PBSO, we tried to really take into account, well, what is the expenditure on peace building, as much as we can categorize and count. And when we look at it compared to the cost of conflict, combined peacekeeping and peace building accounts for only 2% of the cost of conflict. So this suggests a serious underinvestment and reinforces the point that the world is spending a lot on violence and very little on building peace. Which brings me to, well, what do we do around building peace and how do we think about it? So the long-term focus for IEP is not just to look at conflict and conflict trends, but try to see what we can understand about peace in the most peaceful countries. And we believe that understanding the drivers of peacefulness will allow us to better invest in them and will be the key to more long-term peace-building success. So the Global Peace Index is a measure of negative peace, as I mentioned, but our work on positive peace is really trying to understand what are those drivers of peacefulness. And what we've come up with is that we've taken all the data from the Global Peace Index and we've analyzed it against about 9,000 cross-country data sets, attitudinal surveys, to try to understand from a statistical perspective what are the common attitudes, institutions, and structures of the most peaceful societies. And so we have now an 8-part taxonomy, and this is really a framework. Note that these factors, well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and sound business environment are multidimensional themselves. They are interrelated, so they're representing a way to view a system and have a conversation about a system, not just about one siloed piece of a society. And they underpin a lot of the common development aims and goals that we've been discussing at the UN and elsewhere. So what have we found when we try to measure positive peace across the world? Well, we've seen that the proportion of resistance movements that are nonviolent is higher in countries with stronger levels of positive peace. So countries that have more effective and inclusive governance, higher levels of human rights, free flow of information, they have lesser resistance movements, and those resistance movements tend to be nonviolent. Now, countries with low levels of positive peace tend to have more shocks. They can be external or internal. So they could be a natural disaster, it can be political unrest. But if you don't have the attitudes, institutions, and structures at a certain level of strength, those shocks tend to be more violent. So what this framework does is it provides a proxy for us to be able to discuss and measure resilience in a society and look at how a country can either adapt to a shock or absorb it without falling into violent conflict and instability. So finally, just to end on a more practical and positive note, is to just mention SDG 16, which, given that we're at the UN, people are likely very familiar with. But the adoption of Goal 16 really is an acknowledgement by the international community that peace and development are linked, that improving levels of peacefulness is important, and that in order to achieve these outcomes, we need to be able to measure and provide an international monitoring framework towards achieving higher levels of peacefulness. So what IEP did this year was we did an initial scoping, taking a look at the targets that have been established under Goal 16 and trying to see which third-party data sources can be used right now to provide an interim measure. And what we've seen is that while this data around conflict, violence, and peace is lacking in a lot of places, there are enough third-party sources to be able to provide some measure of progress, and that's really needed to be able to complement National Statistical Office's efforts as they build the capacity to be able to adequately measure these complex goals. But what really this signifies is back to the whole point of the Global Peace Index project, is that this is a reinforcement that it is needed to have a measure of peace. And that's something that we've been working towards, and we're pleased to see it acknowledged in the international system. So if you want more information, all of our work, interactive maps, the full report is available online. I'll leave this slide up for you. Everything can be downloaded. And thank you.
Thanks so much. It's always so impressive, the work that IEP does with the Global Peace Index. And every year there's a new little bit of information that they manage to dig out of the data sets. I find particularly striking the rising inequality among peaceful and less peaceful societies, quite striking. And of course, the one aspect that we worked on together is the little investment in peace building compared to the total cost of violence. We did a little bit of work on that ourselves. And in Central African Republic, for example, during a 12-year period, there was only a $3 per capita investment by the international community in the most basic institutions that a country needs, political institutions, security institutions, and justice institutions. For a 12-year period, it was only a $3 capita investment, and for some years that amounted only to $1 million. And now we are funding and managing an $850 million peacekeeping operation as a result, I would say.